This is Laurie Moore-Moore with another Texas Brave and Strong podcast. Today's podcast features a special guest, and the topic is bushcraft. For those of you who've tuned into television challenges like the very popular Survivor or Alone, you've seen some bushcraft at work. It's all about outdoor survival skills. The skills our ancestors had to have moving west and settling the frontier. But let's learn more about it from my guest. Harley Retherford, a young man from the beautiful Ozark Mountains in northeastern Oklahoma, not far from the main trail pioneers traveled to the Red River into Texas. Harley practices bushcraft for pleasure in his spare time. So I'm turning to him today to help me understand some of the survival skills practiced by our ancestors and sometimes by outdoorsmen today. Harley, thank you for joining me on Texas Brave and Strong.
You're welcome. I'm really excited about it.
Well, I am too. And let's jump right in and start our conversation with a definition of bushcraft.
Bushcraft is more of an umbrella term. It is a term to cover multiple skills and knowledges that one must acquire to truly be able to survive or even thrive in the wilderness without modern civilization as an aid.
Well, now, I'm especially interested in the role that bushcraft played historically. For example, if you were traveling to Texas on horseback in the 1800s, or you're a former Civil War soldier trying to make it home after the war on foot, you'd really need some key outdoor skills, I think, to survive the trip. What would the principal or basic challenges be in scenarios like that? And then we can come back and talk about specific ways to meet those challenges.
Well, first that would come to mind would likely be shelter. You'd want to be able to be safe from the environment whenever you're sleeping and resting, or whenever it's simply too cold or perhaps even rainy to be out and you don't want to get sick. Aside from that, you have to worry about protecting yourself from animals and predators. You have to worry about acquiring food, keeping yourself warm. Not only that, but you have to worry about simple safety for not injuring yourself while doing something as simple as walking. You fall down a holler with a broken leg and you're kind of stuck.
Okay, I'm going to stop you for a moment. You just used the word holler. Define that for me, if you will.
Well, I've always grown up hearing the word holler, and a holler is simply what many people would call a valley or a vale. It's a deep gouge or gorge in the ground that sometimes there's a creek or a river or spring in, sometimes they're not, and they're usually really beautiful in my opinion, but that's pretty much what they are.
I guess in Texas we might call those arroyos. It sounds like pretty much the same description. All right, so we've got shelter. We've got some concerns about safety, which we can elaborate on. What about fire? I mean, that's part of keeping warm.
Yes, fire. There's a lot of things that fire will get you. First of all, food. You need to cook it most of the time. Keeps you warm, and how you build it, how you build a fire. You need to be very careful in that environment. If you build a fire improperly, you're going to be fighting it until it's going. And you might be fighting it for 2 or 3 hours. And that's 2 or 3 hours you don't get back.
Well, how would you start a fire?
Well, like I had said, building a fire, it's very different than just, piling up wood and torching it. You build a structure with twigs and sticks and grass for the sole purpose of burning it. You have to have a defined spot in your structure for the fire to originate. And to do that, you need to, let's take the standard teepee method that I'm sure most everyone has seen at least. You start at the very bottom with very small twigs and sticks, and you grow to larger and larger pieces that are stacked together in more of a triangle. It'd be a triangle cylinder form, I believe.
What about an upside down fire?
An upside down fire, that is a very unique fire. One that is very useful, primarily because you don't have to tend to it long at all. It will burn. You can make it burn for 6 hours or 12 hours if you know what you're doing. You start by piling large logs on the bottom and crossing them back and forth, putting them together, and getting smaller and smaller as you go up until you get to your tinder on the very top. And as it burns, the coals will fall onto the wood below and burn them, and thus the fire is self-sustaining until it reaches the very bottom. And like I said, if you build it correctly, you can be 12 hours without having to mess with your fire. So you don't have to come back and stop what you're doing every 2 hours or so and stock your fire up.
Okay, that makes sense. So you could start your fire and go out and maybe hunt for your dinner and come back and not have to try to get your fire going again. What about tinder? Talk to me about that.
Well, tinder is, I assume it's called tinder because it is tender to the touch. It is usually soft and pliable. It is very small pieces of wood and grass and such that will catch flame and burn easily. Mm-hmm. It is something that you start your fire with. It is one of the beginning stages of the fire, and you use that to ignite the rest of your flame. You start your flame usually with a spark of some sort into what I like to call a bird's nest, which is a construction of grass that you break the fibers up so it makes it very soft and flammable, and you catch your spark in the bird's nest. You get that to flaming by blowing gently into it and then waving it to cause air to pass through it. You put that in your tinder bundle, and then you put your tinder bundle that is now flaming into your fire, or your construction, rather.
Well, how do you get the spark?
There are many ways. The easiest way in the olden days, if you were a hunter or perhaps, like you said, someone from the Civil War, if you had a firearm and you had easy access to gunpowder, it would be very similar to gasoline in a lighter. You would sprinkle some of your gunpowder into your bird's nest or even your tinder bundle and hook up your firearm, turn it over the side, and depress the trigger. That would throw a spark into the pan that catches the spark to fire the gun. It will also throw a spark downwards because gravity, and it will ignite the gunpowder, thus igniting your bird's nest or your tinder bundle. Another thing you can do is flint and steel. It is a little bit more difficult, and it takes some trial and error to get used to it. There are many ways. Another way is a bow drill. A bow drill is, I'm sure everyone has seen the way to start a fire where you rub a stick between your hands while pressing down on a board. Uh-huh. That is more of an art than a bow drill. A bow drill uses a similar concept. Say you have a board on top of your stick that you use to depress down, and a very loose bow, a bent stick with a string that you wrap around your drill, and you push it back and forward and causes that stick to spin very quickly. The stick then spins on a plate with a notch cut out on the bottom, and it will create enough friction, I apologize, and sawdust to create an ember. You transfer that ember into your bird's nest, and you continue the process from there.
Okay, so it's wood and string technology of the 1800s, it sounds like.
Yes, it is. It is an old Indian trick.
What about feather wood? You were telling me something about that when we talked before the show.
Okay, so feather wood is a very interesting way to get ready to start a fire. It helps a lot. If you know what you're doing, it can be a little complicated. I have very rarely myself been able to correctly create a feather wood or a feather board. You take a stick and you start carving curls off of it, save you do not cut them all the way off. You stop about an inch from the bottom of your stick and allow the curls to stay on, and you continue carving down and down and down around and eventually you have a big ball of curls attached to the bottom of your stick. While your stick, where the curls are attached, is very thin, it will get thicker and thicker towards the top because there's less and less material having been taken off of the stick. Then, whenever you get your tinder going or your bird's nest going, you can even just put the bird's nest into the feather wood and use that as your tinder and have that in your what I would usually call a basin or a bowl of your fire, where the fire is supposed to originate in your construction to burn.
Mm-hmm. So it's really a sophisticated version of wood shavings, it sounds like, all on one stick. Well, you've talked about, I started to say starting, but you've corrected me by using the term building. You've talked about building your fire, using the tinder and so on. What any tips on making sure you have dry wood and dry tinder
Yes.
to start a fire with if you're out in bad weather?
Absolutely. So in areas where it is cold and snowy common, or just moist and wet, you want to gather your tinder either by raking bark off of a tree and then cutting the inside lining bark out and gathering that up along with your dead grass, and then you want to bundle that up in a thin package if you have a leather or something like that, and you want to carry it inside of your coat where it is against your body and your body heat will dry it out. You do that at the beginning of the day, and at the end of the day, your tinder will be dried out to start your fire, because if it's not dry, you're going to have a rough time getting that fire started.
Okay. Well, let's assume that we're talking about our man coming back from the Civil War, and that was a time period when there were marauding bandits, and a lot of soldiers had turned to thievery, and so it might be important to hide your smoke. Keep your fire essentially as hidden as possible. Any ideas on how one can do that?
I have heard of a few, and I have seen a few. Excuse me. One of the ways I have heard of it is to use buffalo droppings or defecation called buffalo chips. I have heard it makes a smokeless fire that you can effectively cook on if you burn the buffalo chips. Another way, my preferred method, primarily because we don't have buffalo in enough number, is to use what I like to call clean and dry wood. That would be, first of all, of course, it's dry, and there's no fungus, there's not anything else on the wood that will burn differently. The drier and cleaner a wood is, it will burn with less smoke and less fumes and less smell, honestly. Mm-hmm. It will still have a smell, but you won't be able to really get it unless you're super close. Another way is to disperse the smoke, either being in a cave with holes or ports towards the top where the smoke can disperse out, or under a thicket of green trees. Please do not start a fire under dead trees. That's asking for problems.
All right. Now, the things you've been talking about require one tool that I would assume is pretty doggone important, and that's a knife. Is there a kind of a knife that would be multi-purpose in bushcraft, because you're not going to be carrying a lot if you're walking or you're just riding with maybe some things rolled in a tarp behind you on the horse?
Yes, it is more towards personal preference, really. However, I prefer a thick-backed knife with one blade, one edge, and about 4 inches long. That is versatile enough to carve, to cook, to feed myself, to use as a fork or a stick. And I can also use it to split wood by batoning. I would also recommend having a hatchet or another larger cutting utensil, like a hand axe or maybe a machete if you have access to it.
All right, so a knife is an important tool, and that sort of opens the question of what are the key things that you could carry and should carry if you know you're going to be out trying to survive in the open country.
Well, back to the basics of bushcraft. I didn't finish those. You want something to build your shelter with. You want something to be able to cut. We covered that. That is a hatchet, axe, or knife. You can use a knife to chop wood. It's going to be slow going, but it will do if you have to use it. You want to be able to prepare your food, so cookware. You want to have the proper cookware. I would suggest not having anything large because, frankly, the larger it is, the heavier it is. And if you're walking any reasonable distance, even a couple pounds, that starts feeling real heavy after a little bit of walking. And, see, a tripod might be well to have if you don't have enough spare rope or twine to make one. However, if you do have the rope or twine or the know-how to make one, you wouldn't need to carry a metal or even wooden tripod because you would be able to fashion one yourself.
Okay, so that cooking pot back in the 1800s would probably have been cast iron, so should it be fairly small then?
Yes, the pot and pan would most likely be cast iron. There were beaten works in that day. However, they were less common than they are, frankly, nowadays. And being as cast iron is relatively heavy, the pot would likely be no bigger than to feed 1 or 2 people at the maximum. And you would use that pot for everything that you heated, unless you're cooking on your pan, which could also double as your lid for your pot. And so your pot you would use to cook your food, heat your water, cook your coffee, anything that needed to have a container that was heating, you would use that pot.
All right. And I guess when you're packing things, you could use your cooking pot to put small things in, things like maybe cording or whatever. All right. So we've got, if we're talking about what you could carry, we have a knife, a cooking pot, maybe a hatchet. You probably are going to have a gun, which would be handy for starting a fire if nothing else. And also, I would think it would increase your safety. What is all this wrapped in or carried in?
Likely a tarp of some sort. The old style tarps that I know of were either oilcloths or leathers that were stitched together to make them large enough to be an effective covering, usually around 6 foot by 8 foot or something in that regards. And you can make a multitude of shelters with something small like that. I understand that it is a relatively small tarp. However, there are many shelters that are easy to make with a small tarp, and if you do it correctly, you will be of no wanting of space.
All right, I think I'm going to save questions about shelters for a little bit, and let's jump to water, because certainly water is a necessity. You're out there, there are creeks and rivers and maybe lakes. What do you do to make sure you have water that's safe to drink?
There are many ways to clean water. My favorite way, because if you're going to be staying in an area like I prefer to do myself as a hobbyist bushcrafter, is to dig a coyote well. It is to dig a hole about 2 foot away from the shoreline and allow the land to act as a natural filter that the water will seep through and fill that hole. Then you merely dip your water out and boil it. The natural filter of the land will keep your bacterias and gunk and everything else that might be in that water from getting into your water in the coyote well, and anything that is left in it will be easily killed by boiling.
Okay, interesting. So what you're calling the coyote well actually filters things out of the water as the water seeps from the creek or wherever it's coming from. Interesting.
Yes.
Now, you say boil your water. How long do you really have to boil water for it to be safe?
There's a myth that I have heard that you have to boil water for 10 minutes, for 30 minutes, for an hour. You have to boil half the water off. None of that is true. almost everything in that water that can harm you will be killed within about 5 seconds of it boiling. You merely have to bring it to a boil, let it sit for 5 to 10 seconds, and pull it off.
Oh, so it's a much faster process than I would have guessed. Well, that's good. I remember reading that the Texas Rangers would give to their rangers a supply of what they called panola, which was a dried or parched corn that had been seasoned. And they gave it to them, and the rangers carried it in their pockets or small leather bags or what have you, and they would take a couple of pieces and suck on those pieces when they got thirsty and water wasn't, quickly available to them. Are you familiar with panola?
No, not really. But I do something that is very similar to that. In work with cabinetry, if I was thirsty and didn't have ease of access to water, I would simply take my knife and take a random board and cut off a sliver of wood and throw it in my mouth and suck on the sliver of wood. And it's actually rather flavorful. Different woods have different flavors, and you have to find out which one you like best. I prefer alder myself. It's got a very subtle sweetness.
I had no idea wood was flavorful. So alder, you're an alder man when it comes to sucking on a sliver of wood. What about some of the other woods? What does alder taste like, I guess? And then what do some of the other woods taste like? Do you have other favorites and some that you don't like at all?
Well, like I said, alder has a very subtle sweetness. Oak, I know oak because it is bitter and I despise it. Ash is pretty decent. I don't remember the flavor. It's one of those things that you try every year and you don't ever remember it because it doesn't stick. Hickory, I assume it would probably be nutty. It's got an odd flavor. It's hard for me to define, but nutty is probably the closest I can get to it. I haven't tried dark walnut. We did a little bit with dark walnut. However, I believe dark walnut is toxic, so I would not suggest it. And let's see, what else? Poplars, not very good.
So it sounds like alder is the winner, hands up. What about pecan or mesquite? Have you tried those?
No, I have not, unfortunately. If I had access to them, I would definitely, and I hope one day I can.
Well, I love the concept of wood having flavors, something that had never occurred to me before. This has been Laurie Moore-Moore with Texas Brave and Strong, the best little podcast in Texas. We air every other week. Thanks for tuning in. Y'all come back.